to write about who we are, though, is kind of, I'm Canadian. So that way you've already transgressed. You're the, what do you call it, the tall poppy.
Well, I actually talk about the tall poppy syndrome here as one of the elements of our character. My head was lopped off. I have a chapter. This is many chapters of many Canadians. One of them is called The Capital Canadian, in which I lament the demise of our national capital. That could be grand, that should be grand, that should be a repository of our hopes and dreams and aspirations. It should be beautiful. In some places it is, but by and large it's not. And I have been skewered in Ottawa, where I live and write and teach. Some people have said tall poppy syndrome, but then, okay, if that's the case, well, then it proves the point. But this is more than about capital Canadian. It's about the unconscious Canadian who is cut off from his or her past, doesn't know his history, doesn't worry that 2/3 of our historic sites are in peril or disintegrating, according to the Auditor General, doesn't really care that the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa, the Canadian Museum of Civilization, is actually quite politically correct and won't talk about the Louis Riel Rebellion, or won't talk about the Siege of Quebec in 1759. They're just areas that won't go. There's that Canadian. There's the American Canadian, which addresses our tortuous and enduring relationship with the United States. The last of the hyphenated Canadians, I think, is the American Canadian. And we are not sure what to make of the United States. We create a whole culture of differences, what I call the narcissism of small differences, defining ourselves by what we are not as opposed to what we are. The casual Canadian is about citizenship and how we've devalued it, how we accept dual citizenship, or we do in the Leader of the Opposition, how our Governor General didn't renounce her dual citizenship, she as Commander-in-Chief, Michaëlle Jean, until two days before she was installed as Governor General, didn't quite see the need to do it, and the Prime Minister didn't seem until late to need to ask her. This is a country that took 15,000 Canadians out of Lebanon last summer, half of whom went back because their association or connection to Canada was very, very slight. So the casual Canadian has diminished his citizenship, considers it a right for people coming here rather than a responsibility or a privilege, and asks very little from those who come here in terms of what they ought to do to participate in our society. So there are many elements of my unfinished Canadian, and those are just some.
Was it fun to get up and rant a bit? I mean, because it's not, it's part of your job as a columnist to do that, but it's not that we collectively do that. We grumble at Tim Hortons. We don't rant.
Well, everyone's free to describe it as what it has been called incendiary. It says some people have said, one reviewer said it will alienate some people, in which for others that he was Prime Minister of Canada. I don't consider myself, quite frankly, a ranter. The first two chapters are rooted in history, what I call the hybrid Canadian. I look at the French, the English, and the Americans. The observed Canadian looks at all those people who've come here historically, and from Rupert Brooke, who said the country is alive but not kicking, to Rudyard Kipling, who loved it and said, "You are the un-American." So I like to think, because I teach in a university, I'm a professor of journalism and international affairs at Carleton, I have some sense of prudence and caution in writing this. Some people have called it a rant. I would hate to think it's that alone. I would say the language is strong in places, deliberately so. I think that we have to be passionate and actually have to be angry about things, about the lack of civility in our politics, about the manner in which we treat our public servants, whom we are always scrutinizing and think they're spending too much money. The way former prime ministers treat each other, which is by and large lousy compared to how former American presidents treat each other. So I think there's a lot to be said there. I think that when I talk about our relationship with the United States, and we've dined out on a fair degree of self-righteousness and anti-Americanism, but if we look at who we are, really, we are more, there probably are no two peoples on earth more alike than Canada and the United States, and Canadians and Americans. And yet we've created a whole culture which was, I suppose, caught by Michael Adams in his book of 4 years ago called Fire and Ice, in which he said our values are diverging with the United States. I'd say they're converging. And if you look at the political culture, and much of this book is drawn from the political culture. It's not just stream of consciousness stuff I'm pulling out of there. It looks at our institutions, our culture, our history, and draws lessons from them. So I would hope it's reserved and prudent, but I would say also it's passionate, and I guess in points it is angry.
Titled The Unfinished Canadian. I'm okay about that. I like the fact that we're not finished.
For years we were considered among nations, in the grammar or language of nations, a question mark. My sense is we're more than a question mark. We're a colon in the grammar of nations. And what I mean by that is there is more to follow, that our best years lie ahead, that we have always looked at the future with optimism. And that's the Canada that is changing. We are not nomads in the folds of an African desert. We are not a people scrambling on the rainforest in South America. We are in the slipstream of civilization. We are indeed, some people would say, the slipstream itself. We are always welcoming new trends, new ideas, and we reinvent ourselves. And that's why we're unfinished. So any of those Canadians I spoke about, the unconscious Canadian, the American Canadian, the casual Canadian, the capital Canadian, the chameleon Canadian, which is about tall poppy and other, none of those is necessarily the future Canadian. The unfinished Canadian is the Canadian who keeps evolving. And that's our story. And that's why this country will continue in its blessed land, facing challenges, and I talk about the challenges that we'll face over the next, quarter century or more, half century. But I'm optimistic. This is a great, a good people, in sitting on a wonderful piece of land, with a history, a geography, a prosperity, a diversity, and an imagination, if it only will seize that and become the people it can become.
The book is The Unfinished Canadian, The People We Are. I've been speaking with the author Andrew Cohen and The Unfinished Canadian, published by McClelland and Stewart.